Welcome back to Fear Rest. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 disturbing stories from the Alaskan wilderness, tales of people who ventured into some of the most remote, unforgiving terrain on Earth and encountered something that defied explanation. These are accounts from those who survived to tell what they saw in places where darkness lasts for months and civilization is just a memory. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The cabin I inherited from my uncle sat about 40 miles northwest of Fairbanks, tucked into a valley so remote you couldn't see another structure in any direction. Uncle Raymond had lived there for 32 years, trapping and hunting, barely coming into town except for supplies twice a year. When he died, heart attack, they said, found him in his bed. I was the only family left to claim the place. I'd visited exactly once when I was 12, remembered it being cold and dark and smelling like wood smoke and coffee grounds. I was 31 that October when I finally made the trip up to see what I'd inherited. Probably should have gone during summer, but work kept getting in the way, and by the time I had a free week, the first snow had already fallen. The property manager in Fairbanks, a woman named Greta Holloway who'd been collecting rent from a hunting group that used the cabin occasionally, said I should wait until spring. But I wanted to see it, maybe figure out if it was worth keeping or if I should just sell it sight unseen. The drive took longer than I expected. The road turned to gravel about 20 miles out, then to something that was barely a road at all. I had to stop twice to clear fallen branches. My coffee had gone cold in the cup holder, tasted like pennies when I tried to finish it. When I finally reached the cabin, it was late afternoon, the sun already sinking toward the horizon in that way it does up there, like it's in a hurry to disappear. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. One room basically, with a loft space and a wood stove that dominated the center. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. Uncle Raymond's things were still there, his coats on hooks by the door, his boots lined up underneath, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the counter. He had felt wrong to be there, like I was trespassing. I spent the first hour just cleaning, sweeping out mouse droppings and wiping down surfaces. I'd brought supplies for 3 days, figured that would be enough time to inventory everything and decide what to do. The stove still worked, and there was a decent stack of firewood under a tarp outside. By the time I got a fire going, it was full dark, that complete darkness you don't get anywhere near cities, where you can't see your hand in front of your face without a light. That's when I started noticing things felt off, small things at first. I'd set my phone on the counter, and when I turned around it was on the table. I told myself I'd moved it and forgotten. Then I found one of the kitchen drawers open, the one with utensils. I was sure I hadn't opened it. The cabin was settling, I thought. Old places do that. Around 9 o'clock, I heard the knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the door. I froze with a pot of soup halfway to my mouth. The nearest neighbor, if you could call them that, was at least 15 miles away. Nobody knew I was here except Greta, and she certainly wouldn't drive out in the dark. I waited, listening. My heart was doing this thing where it felt like it was beating in my throat. After maybe 30 seconds, the knocks came again. Same rhythm, 3 slow, measured knocks. I walked to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. "Who is it?" My voice came out smaller than I wanted. Nothing. Just the wind moving through the trees. I opened the door. The snow outside was undisturbed, perfect and white in every direction, glowing faintly under the starlight. No footprints, no tracks, no sign anyone had been there at all. I stood there for longer than I should have, staring out into the darkness beyond the reach of the light spilling from the cabin. The trees were black shapes against a slightly less black sky. Everything was silent in that heavy way that makes your ears ring. When I finally closed the door, my hands were numb from gripping the frame. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a branch hitting the side of the cabin. Maybe it was ice falling from the roof. But I knew what knuckles on wood sounded like, and that's what I'd heard. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the loft, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to every creak and pop of the cabin settling. Twice I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate steps from one end to the other. Each time I worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there. Morning came like a relief. I made coffee, it tasted burnt, but I drank it anyway, and decided I'd spend the day going through Uncle Raymond's things, then leave that evening instead of staying 2 more nights. That's when I found the journal. It was in a drawer under his bed, a leather-bound notebook filled with his cramped handwriting. Most of it was mundane, notes about weather, trap locations, counts of pelts. But the last few entries were different. November 3rd, it came to the door again last night, 3 knocks, same as always, I don't answer anymore. November 7th, I saw it today standing at the tree line, tall, too tall. It was watching the cabin. When I looked away to grab my rifle, it was gone. November 12th, it sounds like Margaret now, my Margaret, calling my name from the woods. She's been dead 6 years. It knows, and it's using her voice. The entries stopped there. Uncle Raymond had died 2 weeks later. I was still holding the journal when I heard my name. It came from outside, distant but clear. A woman's voice calling Marcus, Marcus, are you there? I don't have a sister. My mother's been gone since I was 19. There was no woman who knew I was here, no woman who would be out in this wilderness calling for me. I went to the window, my legs feeling disconnected from my body. There was someone standing at the tree line, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. The figure was wrong, that's the only way I can describe it. Too tall, proportions that didn't quite make sense. It stood completely still, and even from that distance, I could feel it looking at the cabin. At me. Marcus, it called again, and the voice was perfect. It was my mother's voice, the exact way she used to call me in for dinner when I was young. Come here, sweetheart, come talk to me. I backed away from the window, my breath coming fast and shallow. Every instinct in my body was screaming that I needed to leave, needed to get in my truck and drive until I hit Fairbanks. But when I looked toward where I'd parked, my truck was gone. I know that sounds impossible. I know how it sounds. But the space where I'd parked was empty, just undisturbed snow reflecting the morning light. Marcus, please. The voice was closer now. I need you to come outside. I need to see you. I grabbed my keys, my phone, didn't bother with anything else. I ran out the back door. There was a second entrance through the small storage room and into the woods behind the cabin. The snow was knee-deep in places, and I fell twice, scrambling back to my feet and pushing forward. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I kept moving. Behind me, I could hear it following, not running, just walking at that same measured pace. Branches snapping, snow crunching. And my mother's voice, sometimes close, sometimes far away, always calling my name. When I finally broke through to the access road, my truck was there, parked exactly where I'd left it. I fumbled with the keys, my fingers so numb I could barely grip them, and threw myself inside. The drive back to Fairbanks is a blur. I remember crying at some point, remember my hands shaking so badly I had to pull over twice to collect myself. I sold the cabin through Greta, never went back. She asked once if I wanted any of Uncle Raymond's personal effects, and I told her to burn it all. But sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I hear 3 slow knocks on my apartment door. And sometimes, just before I wake up, I hear my mother's voice calling my name from somewhere far away. Last week, I found a photograph on my phone that I don't remember taking. It's dark and blurry, but you can make out the cabin in the background. And in the foreground, partially obscured by trees, there's something tall standing in the snow. The image is too unclear to make out details, but I can see it's looking toward whoever took the picture. The metadata says the photo was taken at 3 in the morning on my second night there. I don't remember waking up. I don't remember going outside. Story 2. Denali National Park in March is not a place most people choose to visit. The tourist season doesn't really start until late May, and for good reason. Temperatures hover around zero, the landscape is harsh, and you're more likely to encounter a bear coming out of hibernation than another human being. But I was working on my thesis in wildlife biology, specifically tracking lynx populations, and March was exactly when I needed to be there. My advisor, Dr. Helena Voss, had secured permits for me to stay at one of the ranger stations deep in the interior, about 18 miles from the nearest maintained road. It was just a small cabin, really, used mostly in summer by researchers and the occasional ranger doing boundary surveys. I'd be alone for 10 days, checking camera traps and collecting scat samples. I'm not going to lie, I was excited. I'd spent most of my graduate program in libraries and labs, and this felt like real fieldwork, the kind of thing I'd gotten into biology to do in the first place. My boyfriend, Connor, thought I was insane. He kept asking why I couldn't study lynx somewhere warmer, somewhere that didn't require flying into Fairbanks, and then taking a helicopter to a cabin where the nearest person was a 2-day hike away. The helicopter pilot, a grizzled man named Dale Pritchard, who looked like he'd been flying in Alaska since before I was born, didn't say much during the flight. He pointed out a few landmarks, mentioned that the radio in the cabin could be temperamental but should work fine for emergencies. He'd be back in 10 days, he said, unless I called for an early pickup, which would cost extra. When he left, the silence was absolute. I'd been in quiet places before, camping in the Rockies, a research trip to Montana, but this was different. This was a silence so complete it felt like pressure in your ears, like the land itself was holding its breath. The first 3 days were fine, good, even. I settled into a routine, wake up at dawn, check the nearest camera traps, collect samples, return to the cabin by early afternoon to log data, and prepare for the next day. I saw lynx tracks, found scat that I carefully bagged and labeled, and even glimpsed what might have been a lynx itself moving through distant trees, though it was too far away to be certain. The cabin was basic but functional. A wood stove, a narrow bed, a table and chair, shelves with canned food and emergency supplies. There was a battery-powered radio that I checked every evening, mostly picking up static, but occasionally catching fragments of weather reports from Fairbanks. At night I'd heat up soup and read by lantern light, feeling pleasantly isolated and independent. On the 4th day, I found the first camera destroyed. I'd placed 6 cameras total in a rough circle around the cabin, each strapped to a tree at chest height, angled to capture game trails. This one, camera 3 on the east side of my survey area, was lying in the snow. The strap had been cut, clean and deliberate, not torn. The casing was cracked open, the memory card missing. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes trying to understand what I was looking at. Bears didn't cut straps. Lynx didn't have any interest in cameras. Another person. But why, and who would even be out here? I told myself it was probably another researcher I didn't know about, maybe someone doing their own project who got curious. It was annoying that camera represented both data and money, but not terrifying, not yet. Camera 5 was gone entirely when I checked it the next morning. Just the tree where it had been, the strap nowhere to be found. No tracks in the snow around it, which didn't make sense because I'd left clear prints approaching it, and the snow had been undisturbed otherwise since the last small snowfall 2 days prior. That night, I tried the radio. It took 20 minutes of adjusting the dial before I got anything that sounded like a human voice, and even then it was more static than words. I explained about the cameras, asked if there were any other researchers in the area. The voice on the other end, I think it was a ranger station, but I couldn't be sure, said something about checking records and told me to try calling again tomorrow. I didn't feel like reading that night. I kept looking at the windows, even though I'd covered them with the heavy curtains that were meant to keep heat in. Every sound made me jump, the stove ticking as it cooled, wind moving through the eaves, the cabin settling. Around midnight, I heard something walking around outside, not an animal. The footsteps were too measured, too steady. They circled the cabin slowly, and I could track them by sound, starting at the front door, moving along the north wall around the back, along the south wall back to the front. Then they stopped. I was holding a flashlight in one hand and a can of bear spray in the other, sitting on the edge of the bed when I heard my name. Jenna. It was quiet, almost questioning. A man's voice, muffled by the walls but definitely saying my name. Jenna, I know you're in there. Can you open the door? My throat was so dry I couldn't have answered if I wanted to. Nobody knew my name out here. Dale the pilot had called me Miss the entire flight. The permits were filed under Dr. Voss's name. I hadn't told anyone in the park my first name. Jenna, please, I'm lost, I need help. The voice sounded reasonable, concerned. Exactly how someone who was actually lost would sound. But every instinct I had was telling me not to move, not to respond, not to acknowledge that I'd heard. The door handle rattled, once then again harder. I watched the handle move in the dim light from the banked fire in the stove. It turned fully, but I'd locked the deadbolt and the door held. Jenna. The voice was different now, flatter. Open the door. I stayed frozen on the bed until morning. The footsteps eventually moved away, but I didn't hear them leave. They just stopped, like someone had paused mid-stride and decided to stand still. When dawn finally came, I packed my essentials into my backpack with shaking hands. I'd hike to the pickup point, even though Dale wasn't due back for 6 more days. I'd wait there if I had to. I'd dig a snow shelter. Anything was better than staying in that cabin. But when I opened the door, I saw what was waiting for me. Arranged in a perfect line leading away from the cabin, spaced exactly 5 feet apart, were my missing camera traps. All 6 of them, including the ones that should have still been on their trees. They formed a path leading into the woods, each camera facing back toward the cabin. The memory cards were placed on top of each camera, balanced carefully in the center. I stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at that line of cameras. My mind was trying to find an explanation that made sense, some rational reason for what I was seeing, but it kept sliding away from me like water. I didn't follow the path. Instead, I went north, perpendicular to the line, moving as fast as I could through snow that sometimes came up to my thighs. I used my compass and the position of the sun to navigate toward where I thought the pickup point was, though I wasn't entirely sure anymore. My sense of direction felt scrambled, like the landscape itself had shifted overnight. It took me 3 days to reach the clearing where Dale had dropped me off. 3 days of hiking during daylight and huddling under emergency blankets at night, rationing the protein bars I'd grabbed from the cabin. 3 days of hearing my name called from different directions, always distant, always in that same flat voice. Dale found me on the morning of the 4th day, 2 days ahead of schedule. He said he'd gotten a weird feeling and decided to check in early. I didn't ask him to elaborate. I just climbed into the helicopter and watched the cabin shrink to a tiny square surrounded by white as we lifted away. I never finished my thesis. I switched to a different focus entirely, something that involved lab work exclusively. Dr. Voss was disappointed, but understanding when I told her I decided field research wasn't for me after all. I still have the memory cards from the cameras. I found them in my backpack when I got back to Fairbanks, though I don't remember packing them. I've never looked at what's on them. They're in a locked box in my closet, and sometimes I think about throwing them away, but I'm afraid of what might happen if I do. A Story 3. The ice road between Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse only exists for about 3 months out of the year, when the ocean freezes solid enough to support heavy vehicles. I was working as a truck driver that winter, hauling supplies for the oil companies, and the money was incredible. Hazard pay on top of the base rate, bonuses for each completed run. It was brutal work, 14-hour days in temperatures that could drop to 40 below, but I was 28 and broke, and trying to pay off student loans from a degree I wasn't using. Most of the other drivers were veterans of the ice roads, guys who'd been doing this for 10 or 15 years, and had stories about ice giving way or whiteouts so complete you couldn't see your hood ornament. They looked at rookies like me with a mixture of pity and amusement. One of them, a Yupik man named Peter Ayuluk, who always wore the same faded blue parka, told me the ice remembered things. I didn't know what he meant, and I didn't ask. The run I'm talking about happened in late February. I'd been on the ice roads for 6 weeks by then, felt like I was starting to get the hang of it. This particular haul was routine, drilling equipment and fuel bound for a rig about 60 miles out. The route was well marked with reflective poles every 100 yards, and the weather report was decent. Clear skies, light wind, visibility good. I left Dead Horse at 4 in the morning when it was still dark, though in February that far north, dark and light are relative terms. The sun barely cleared the horizon even at midday. My truck was loaded heavy, the trailer groaning behind me as I headed out onto the ice. For the first hour, everything was fine. I'd driven this route maybe 20 times already, knew where the rough patches were, where you had to slow down for pressure ridges. The radio played classic rock, staticky but clear enough. I had coffee in a thermos, was making good time. Around mile 40, I saw someone standing on the ice. They were just off to the right of the road, maybe 30 feet away. A figure in dark clothing, standing completely still, facing away from me. No vehicle anywhere nearby, no equipment, nothing that would explain why anyone would be out here. I slowed down, not stopping but dropping to maybe 10 miles an hour. You don't just ignore someone stranded on the ice. People die out here, freeze solid in hours if they're not dressed right. But something about the figure made my stomach clench. As I drew even with them, they turned their head to watch me pass. I couldn't see their face. The angle was wrong, or maybe it was just too dark, but where their face should have been was just shadow. Deep shadow, darker than it should have been, like someone had cut a hole in the world. I hit the gas harder than I meant to, the trailer fishtailing slightly before I corrected. In the side mirror, I watched the figure turn slowly back to face away from the road, returning to their original position like they were on a pivot. My hands were sweating inside my gloves. I radioed back to base, trying to sound casual. "Hey, this is Unit 17. Just passed someone standing out on the ice around mile marker 40. Might want to send someone to check on them." The dispatcher, a woman named Ruth Carpenter, who always sounded half asleep, Took a few seconds to respond. Copy that, 17. We don't have any personnel out that way today. Can you describe them? Dark clothes, just standing there, facing west, I think. Visible distress. I know, no distress, just standing. Another pause. Okay, I'll note it. Probably one of the ice fishermen from the native camp. They sometimes walk out pretty far. But I'd been past the native camp. It was 15 miles behind me, and there was no way someone had walked this far out onto the ice just to stand in the dark doing nothing. I tried to focus on the road, on making my delivery and getting back before I had to drive this section in full darkness. But I kept thinking about that figure, the way it had turned its head with mechanical precision, the absence where its face should have been. At mile 45, I saw another one. This one was on the left side of the road, closer, maybe 20 feet away. Same dark clothing, same posture, standing perfectly still, facing away. I didn't slow down this time. I kept my speed steady, eyes locked straight ahead, and absolutely refused to look in the mirror as I passed. But I felt it turn to watch me. I felt its attention like cold water down my spine. Mile 47, another figure right side. Mile 49, two figures, one on each side of the road, standing exactly parallel to each other. Mile 51, three figures clustered together, all facing away. I was breathing hard, my hands locked on the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The radio was just static now, Ruth's voice completely gone. I tried switching channels, got nothing but white noise on every frequency. The reflective poles that marked the road started to look wrong. They'd been evenly spaced, but now they seemed closer together or maybe farther apart, the distances inconsistent in a way that made my eyes hurt when I tried to focus on them. At mile 53, I saw the rig. It was off to the right, maybe half a mile out on the ice. A massive drilling platform lit up like a small city, floodlights blazing against the darkness. But I knew for a fact there was no rig at this location. The rig I was delivering to was at mile 60, and there was nothing else out here. The ice wasn't stable enough for platforms, except at very specific tested sites. I looked away, focused on the road, but in my peripheral vision I could see the lights moving, spreading out, multiplying until there were dozens of rigs scattered across the ice, all glowing with the same cold light. The figures were everywhere now. Hundreds of them, standing at irregular intervals as far as I could see, all facing away from the road, all absolutely still. I started counting seconds in my head, marking time, trying to ground myself in something concrete. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. At 60 seconds, I'd check the odometer, see how far I'd traveled, use that to estimate how much farther I had to go. But when I looked at the odometer after counting to 60, it read mile 53, the same as before. I counted to 60 again, looked again. Mile 53. My chest was getting tight, my breath coming in short gasps that fogged the inside of the windshield. I cranked the heater down, cracked the window, let the brutal cold air blast my face. That's when I heard the sound. It was coming from underneath the truck, a grinding, scraping noise like metal on ice. But it wasn't constant. It rose and fell in a rhythm almost like breathing. The whole truck shuddered with it, the trailer swaying despite the straight road. Something hit the underside of the cab, hard, a boom that rattled my teeth. Then again, something under the ice pacing the truck, slamming against it from below. I floored the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, engines screaming, trailer sliding back and forth behind me. The impacts kept coming, steady as a heartbeat, matching my speed no matter how fast I went. The figures were closer now, standing right at the edge of the road, and as I passed each one, they turned to follow me with that same mechanical precision. I could see them in both mirrors, a growing crowd of turning heads, all tracking my movement across the ice. Mile 54 appeared on the odometer, then 55, 56. The impact stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. My ears were ringing, my whole body vibrating with adrenaline. At mile 59, the figures disappeared. One moment they were everywhere, the next the ice was empty except for the reflective poles marching into the darkness. The phantom rigs blinked out like someone had thrown a switch. The radio crackled back to life. Unit 17, do you copy? 17, respond. I'm here, I said, my voice hoarse. I'm here, mile 59. Jesus, 17, you've been offline for almost an hour. We were about to send someone out. What's your status? I looked at the clock on the dash. According to it, only 12 minutes had passed since I'd radioed about the first figure. I'm fine, I lied. Some radio trouble, continuing to destination. I delivered the equipment, turned around, and drove back to Dead Horse in a near trance. The return trip was completely normal, empty ice, well-marked road, no figures, no lights, no impacts from below. It was like nothing had happened. But when I got back and they unloaded the truck, one of the dock workers called me over. He pointed at the underside of the trailer. There were handprints in the ice that had frozen to the metal. Dozens of them, frozen solid, fingers splayed, pressed up against the underside like something had been trying to push through from below. They had to use heat guns to remove them. I finished out the season, needed the money too badly to quit, but I never took a night run again. Only drove in daylight, such as it was. Peter saw the look on my face that morning and just nodded, like he understood exactly what had happened. The ice remembers, he said again, and this time I didn't ask him to explain. The story 4. I've been working for the Alaska Pipeline Service Company for 3 years when they sent me to check on a monitoring station about 90 miles northwest of Fairbanks. It was supposed to be a routine maintenance visit. Every 6 weeks, someone had to physically inspect these remote stations, make sure the sensors were clean, equipment functioning, no signs of damage or wildlife interference. Most of the time it was boring work, but it paid well and got me out of the office. The station I'm talking about, Station 47, they called it, though I never knew why the numbering system skipped around like it did, sat in a small clearing surrounded by black spruce and dwarf birch. No roads to speak of, just a helicopter landing pad and the station itself, which was basically a reinforced shed housing monitoring equipment and a small emergency shelter. I flew in with a pilot named Jackson Torres on a clear morning in early April. The snow was starting to melt in places, creating patches of muddy ground between drifts. Jackson said he'd be back in 6 hours, plenty of time for me to run through my checklist and make any minor repairs. The station looked fine from the outside. No obvious damage, door still locked, solar panels clean. I let myself in with the master key and started the inspection. Temperature sensors check, pressure gauges check, radio relay functioning, battery backup full charge. Everything was exactly as it should be. I was finishing up, maybe 4 hours in, when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, almost sweet, like rotting vegetation but not quite. I checked the ventilation system, thinking maybe something had died in the air intake. Birds sometimes nested in the vents, or mice got in during winter. But the filters were clean. The smell was coming from outside. I stepped out of the station and immediately saw what I'd somehow missed on my walk around the perimeter. About 20 yards into the trees, the snow had melted in a perfect circle. The ground inside the circle was bare earth, dark and wet, and nothing was growing there, not even moss. I'm not a superstitious person, I studied engineering, believe in systems and processes, in cause and effect. But looking at that circle of dead ground made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't rationalize. I should have left it alone. I should have finished my paperwork, radioed Jackson for early pickup, and gotten out of there. But I'm also curious by nature, always have been, and I wanted to understand what I was looking at. I walked over to the circle's edge. The transition from snow-covered ground to bare earth was sharp, like someone had cut it with a compass. The earth inside was dark, almost black, and when I crouched down to touch it, it was warm. Not sun-warm, not residual heat from the day. It was actively warm, like body temperature, and it pulsed slightly under my fingers. I jerked my hand back and stood up fast enough to make myself dizzy. That's when I saw the tracks. They led from the center of the circle into the woods, heading roughly northeast. They looked human at first glance, the right size, the right general shape, but the spacing was off. The stride was too long, each print a good 6 feet from the last, like whatever made them had been taking enormous steps, or maybe jumping, hopping. The thought made me laugh, a weird nervous sound that died quickly in the silence. I followed the tracks. I don't know why. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to go back to the station, lock myself in, wait for Jackson. But my feet just started moving, and I followed those tracks into the trees. They went on for maybe 100 yards, always that same impossible spacing. Then they stopped at the base of a large spruce tree. Just stopped, like whatever made them had walked directly into the tree and vanished. I was standing there staring at the last print when I heard the breathing. It was coming from above me, slow, rattling breaths, like someone with fluid in their lungs. I looked up into the branches and saw something looking back down. I can't describe it properly. Every time I try, the details slip away like water. It was too large and too small at the same time, all wrong proportions, and it was clinging to the tree trunk about 15 feet up. I remember arms. I think they were arms, bent at angles that weren't right, and something that might have been a face but wasn't arranged like a face should be. It was watching me with an intensity that felt physical, like pressure behind my eyes. I backed away slowly, not making any sudden movements, every muscle in my body locked tight. It didn't move, just kept breathing that wet, rattling breath. When I'd put maybe 10 yards between us, it spoke. Not words exactly. More like the idea of words, shapes of sound that your brain tried to interpret as language. It hurt to hear, made my molars ache and my vision blur at the edges. Then it dropped from the tree. I ran. Properly ran, not caring about the noise or the broken branches or anything except getting back to the station. Behind me I could hear it moving through the forest, that same hopping gait that had made the tracks, each impact shaking the ground. I reached the station and slammed the door behind me, threw the deadbolt, grabbed the radio. "Jackson, this is Station 47. I need immediate pickup. Emergency pickup. Do you copy?" "Static, Jackson, respond. This is an emergency." Nothing but white noise. I tried every channel, every frequency. The equipment was working. I could see the signal strength, could hear the static changing as I adjusted the dial. But no voices came through, no response from base, nothing. Something hit the outside of the station. A heavy, deliberate impact against the wall, hard enough to make the equipment shake on its mounts. Then another impact on a different wall, another. It was circling the building, hitting it rhythmically, and I realized it was testing the structure, looking for weak points. The window in the door was just a small square of reinforced glass, but I could see movement through it. Something tall passing back and forth, never quite visible entirely, always just at the edge of the frame. The impacts continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Then they stopped, Silence, complete silence, not even wind in the trees. I waited, barely breathing, the radio microphone clutched in my hand like a talisman. The door handle began to turn. Slowly, deliberately, the handle rotated as far as it could go before hitting the locked deadbolt. It stayed there for a moment, testing the resistance, then released. A pause. Then it turned again, same motion, same testing pressure. Over and over, that handle turning and releasing, mechanical and patient. I backed away until I hit the far wall, as far from the door as I could get in the small space. The radio was still producing nothing but static, and my phone, which I grabbed from my pocket with shaking hands, had no signal at all. The handle stopped turning. For maybe 30 seconds there was nothing. Then something moved past the window and a face pressed against the glass. I thought it was human for just a second. It had eyes or something like eyes and a mouth or something like a mouth. But the proportions were stretched, distorted, like someone had taken a human face and pulled it lengthwise until it was twice as long as it should be. It looked at me through the glass, and its mouth opened wider than any jaw should open. Then it was gone. I heard the helicopter before I consciously recognized what the sound was. The familiar whomp-whomp of rotor blades, getting louder, coming in for landing. Jackson's voice crackled through the radio. "Station 47, this is your pickup. Ground control sent me an early, some kind of system alert from your station. You good?" I didn't trust my voice to answer. I just grabbed my pack, waited until I heard the rotors winding down, then burst out of the station and ran for the helicopter. Jackson looked confused when I threw myself into the passenger seat and slammed the door. "Whoa, you okay? You look." "Just go," I said. "Please just take off." He must have seen something in my face because he didn't argue, just fired up the turbine and lifted us out of there. As we rose above the tree line, I looked down at the station. The circle of dead earth was bigger now, maybe twice the size it had been, and in the center of it, something tall and thin stood perfectly still, its elongated face turned up to watch us leave. I filed a report about potential wildlife activity and equipment malfunction. Recommended Station 47 for structural inspection. 2 weeks later, I got a call from my supervisor saying the station had been decommissioned. No explanation, just a note in the system that it was no longer operational. I didn't ask why. I was just glad I'd never have to go back, but I still have nightmares about that handle turning, about that face pressed against the glass, mouth opening wider and wider. And sometimes I wake up convinced I can hear that wet, rattling breathing coming from somewhere in my apartment, even though I know that's impossible. Last month, I found a handprint on my bedroom window. On the outside, 6 floors up, where no one could possibly reach. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow, and when I measured it, the print was exactly the size of those tracks I'd seen in the snow. The story 5. My grandmother's fishing cabin sat on the bank of the Kuskokwim River, about 40 miles from the nearest town of Bethel. She'd used it every summer for as long as I could remember, catching salmon and pike and hanging them to dry on racks outside. When she passed away, this was in January of 2017, I think, or maybe early 2018, my mother asked if I wanted to go clear out the cabin before we sold it. I said yes, mostly because I felt guilty for not visiting Grandma more often in her last years. I flew into Bethel in March, rented a snow machine, and made the trip out to the cabin on a gray afternoon when the temperature was hovering around 10 below. The river was still frozen solid, and the landscape was that particular shade of white-gray that makes everything look flat and distant at the same time. The cabin was smaller than I remembered from childhood visits. One room, a loft accessible by a ladder, a wood stove that my grandmother had insisted was plenty to keep warm even in the depths of winter. Her fishing gear was still hanging on hooks inside, and there were jars of preserved berries on a shelf, probably 5 years old at least. I'd brought cleaning supplies, garbage bags, boxes for anything worth keeping. Figured I'd spend 2 days sorting through everything, then haul what I could back to Bethel on the snow machine. The rest could wait until summer when the river thawed and I could bring a boat. The first day went fine. I went through Grandma's clothes, set aside a few items I wanted to keep: her favorite scarf, a pair of beaded gloves she'd made herself. The rest went into bags. I cleaned out the cupboards, threw away anything perishable or too old. By evening I was tired in a good way, physical tired, and I heated up soup on the propane camping stove I'd brought. That night I heard someone singing. It was faint, coming from outside, from somewhere upriver. A woman's voice singing in Yupik, a language I recognized but didn't speak. The melody was repetitive, almost hypnotic, rising and falling in patterns that felt familiar but wrong somehow. I went to the window but couldn't see anything in the darkness, just the white expanse of the frozen river disappearing into the night. The singing continued for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly mid-phrase. I told myself it was someone from one of the other cabins scattered along the river. Sound carried weird over ice and snow, but I knew all those cabins were empty this time of year. Nobody came out here in March, nobody except me. I slept poorly, waking up at every small sound. In the morning, I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed the singing. I spent the second day working on the loft, going through boxes of old photographs and my grandmother's personal papers. That's when I found her journal. It was just a composition notebook, the kind kids use for school, with her handwriting filling the pages. Most of it was mundane notes about fish catches, weather observations, recipes, but there were entries that made my chest tighten. August 14, the woman came to the river again. She stands on the far bank and watches the cabin. I pretend not to see her. As long as I don't acknowledge her, she stays away. August 22, heard singing last night. The old songs, the ones my mother used to sing. But mother is dead 30 years. I didn't go outside. September 3, found her footprints in the mud this morning. They lead right up to the door then vanish. No prints leading away. The entries went back years. Different details, but always the same woman, always watching, always singing. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before my grandmother died. March 9, she's getting bolder. She came to the window last night. I saw her face pressed against the glass. She looks like my sister, but my sister drowned when we were children. She doesn't belong here. I won't let her in. I sat in the loft for a long time holding that notebook, my grandmother's handwriting blurring as my eyes lost focus. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman, maybe early dementia. But my grandmother had been sharp until the day she died, sharper than me in many ways. That afternoon, while I was carrying garbage bags out to the snow machine, I saw the footprints. They came up from the river, crossing the ice, approaching the cabin. Just like my grandmother had written, they led right to the front door, stopping maybe 6 inches from the threshold. And they didn't lead away. The prints were bare feet. In March, in 10 below weather, the kind of cold that would give you frostbite in minutes. I stood there looking at those prints, my breath steaming in the air, and felt something watching me. I turned slowly toward the river. She was standing on the ice about 50 yards away, a woman in a long dark dress, her black hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She was too far away to see her face clearly, but I could feel her attention, focused and intent. She didn't move, just stood there absolutely still, and I realized she wasn't breathing. No clouds of vapor from her mouth, no movement of her chest, just perfect, motionless stillness. I backed toward the cabin door, not taking my eyes off her. She didn't follow, didn't move at all. I fumbled the door open behind me and stepped inside, slammed it shut through the bolt. Through the window, I watched her stand on the ice until darkness fell. She never moved, not even slightly, not even when the wind picked up and started blowing snow across the river. When full darkness came, I couldn't see her anymore, but I knew she was still there. The singing started again around midnight. Closer this time, right outside the cabin. The same Yupik songs, the same hypnotic melody. I covered my ears, but I could still hear it, could feel it resonating in my chest. Then I heard my name, Sarah. It was my grandmother's voice, exact and perfect, speaking in the mixture of English and Yupik she'd always used with me. Sarah, let me in, I'm cold. I pressed my hands harder against my ears, squeezed my eyes shut. Sarah, it's Grandma, please, I need to come inside. The door handle rattled, once, then again. Sarah, the voice was pleading now, desperate, don't leave me out here, I'm so cold, please. I wanted to believe it. God, I wanted to open that door so badly, but I remembered the journal, remembered my grandmother's warning. I won't let her in. The handle stopped rattling. The singing resumed, that same hypnotic pattern, and continued for hours. I sat on the floor with my back against the door, my hands clamped over my ears, and waited for dawn. When morning finally came, the singing stopped. I looked out the window and saw the woman walking away across the ice, heading upriver, her dark dress dragging behind her. She didn't look back. The footprints leading to the door were still there, joined now by dozens more. They covered the area in front of the cabin, overlapping, all barefoot, all stopping at the threshold, none leading away. I left everything, grabbed my pack, got on the snow machine, and drove back to Bethel, going faster than was safe on river ice. I told my mother I'd cleared out what was important, and we should just sell the cabin as is, contents included. She was surprised but didn't argue. The cabin sold 4 months later to a couple from Anchorage who wanted a remote fishing spot. I never told them about the woman on the ice, about the singing, about those footprints. Sometimes I wonder if they've seen her, if they've heard my grandmother's voice calling from outside their door, asking to be let in. I hope they remembered to lock it. Story 6. The research post on the North Slope was supposed to be a 3-week assignment studying permafrost degradation. I was working for a climate research group out of the University of Alaska, and my job was straightforward: collect core samples, measure active layer depth, document changes in vegetation patterns. It was tedious work, but I was being paid well, and the lead researcher, a woman named Dr. Simon Blackwell, who'd been studying Arctic climate for 20 years, had a reputation for running tight, professional operations. There were 4 of us at the post: Dr. Blackwell, myself, a graduate student named Tyler Chen, and a field technician called Vaughn Kowalski, who handled the heavy equipment. The post itself was a modular structure about the size of a large trailer, divided into sleeping quarters, a common area, and a small lab space. We'd been flown in by bush plane and wouldn't see another human being until our scheduled pickup. The landscape around the post was tundra, flat, treeless, covered in low shrubs and sedges that were just starting to turn green as the brief Arctic summer began. In late June, the sun barely set, just dipped toward the horizon before climbing back up. The constant daylight took some getting used to. It made time feel slippery, hours blurring together without the normal day-night cycle to anchor them. Everything was fine for the first week. We fell into a routine: early morning sampling runs, Afternoon lab work, evenings spent analyzing data or reading. Tyler was young and enthusiastic, asked a million questions. Vaughn was quiet but efficient, could fix any piece of equipment that broke. Dr. Blackwell was focused, all business, though she'd occasionally share stories from previous field seasons over dinner. The problem started on day 9. Tyler found it during a routine core sample collection, about half a mile from the post. He came back early, looking pale and unsettled, said we needed to see something. Dr. Blackwell and I followed him back to the site. What he'd found was a hole in the permafrost, not a natural thaw feature, those were common enough. This was perfectly circular, about 3 feet across, descending straight down into the frozen ground. The edges were smooth, almost machined, and when Dr. Blackwell shined her flashlight down into it, we couldn't see the bottom. "That's not natural," Vaughn said, which was probably the longest sentence I'd heard him speak all week. Dr. Blackwell was quiet for a long time, just crouching at the edge and staring down into that perfect circle of darkness. Finally, she said, "We'll need to document this. Tyler, get the camera. I want photographs from multiple angles, measurements, the works." "Should we try to sound it?" I asked. "Drop something down, see how deep it goes." "Let's start with surface documentation, Doctor," Blackwell said, but something in her voice made me think she didn't want to know how deep it went. We spent 2 hours documenting the hole. Tyler took dozens of photographs, while Vaughn and I measured diameter and checked soil composition around the edges. The permafrost surrounding the hole was solid, showed no signs of natural thawing. Whatever had created this had done it recently. There was no vegetation growing near the edges, no weathering of the exposed surfaces. That night back at the post, Dr. Blackwell was agitated in a way I'd never seen her. She kept checking and rechecking the photographs Tyler had uploaded, making notes in her field journal with sharp, aggressive strokes. "Has anyone seen anything like this before?" Tyler asked. "No," Dr. Blackwell said without looking up. "No, I haven't." I dreamed about the hole that night. Dreamed I was standing at the edge looking down, and something at the bottom was looking back up. Something that was aware of me, that knew I was there. I woke up at what I thought was dawn, but when I checked my watch, it was only 11 p.m. The sun was still bright in the sky, and the constant daylight made my head hurt. Vaughn was standing outside the post when I went to get water from the purification system. He was looking toward where we'd found the hole, even though it wasn't visible from here. "You hear that?" he asked when I came up beside him. "Hear what?" He tilted his head, listening. "Sounds like humming, really low, almost below hearing, like a power line, but there's no power lines out here." I listened. At first I didn't hear anything except wind and the occasional call of a bird. Then I caught it, a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself. It was so deep I felt it more than heard it, a thrumming that resonated in my chest. "Probably just the post settling," I said, not believing it. Vaughn looked at me with an expression that suggested he didn't believe it either. The next morning, though again, morning was just a concept we imposed on the endless daylight, Dr. Blackwell said we needed to check on the hole again. There was something in the way she said it, a forced casualness, that made my stomach tighten. When we got to the site, the hole was bigger. Not by much, maybe a foot wider in diameter, but definitely larger than it had been the day before. And the edges were still perfectly smooth, perfectly circular. "Permafrost doesn't melt like that," Tyler said quietly. "Definitely not overnight, and not into a perfect circle." Dr. Blackwell didn't respond. She was staring at something on the ground near the hole, a scattering of small objects that I hadn't noticed immediately. When I got closer, I realized they were bones. Small bones, like from birds or lemmings, but they were arranged in a pattern. A spiral starting from the edge of the hole and extending outward about 6 feet. Each bone had been placed with clear intention, creating a design that was too deliberate to be random. Who did this? Tyler's voice cracked slightly on the question. We all looked at each other. We were the only people within 100 miles. Maybe an animal, I suggested, but even as I said it, I knew how ridiculous it sounded. Dr. Blackwell was taking photographs with shaking hands. We need to document everything. Then we are leaving. Leaving, but we have 2 weeks left in the... We are leaving, she repeated, and something in her tone shut down any argument. That night we prepared for evacuation, packing up essential data and equipment. The Bush plane wasn't scheduled to return for another 13 days, but Dr. Blackwell was trying to arrange an emergency pickup. The satellite phone was being difficult, though the connection kept dropping, and when it did connect, there was interference, a strange clicking pattern underneath the voice of the dispatcher. Around midnight, though the sun was still bright, I went outside to urinate. The post's bathroom was primitive, and I preferred to just walk a little ways from the structure. That's when I saw her standing by the hole. A woman, or something that looked like a woman from a distance. She was too tall, proportions stretched slightly wrong, and she was standing perfectly still, looking down into the hole like she was listening to something at the bottom. I froze, one hand on my zipper, unable to process what I was seeing. She turned her head toward me. Slowly, too slowly, like her neck was on a delay. Even from 50 yards away, I could see her face was wrong. Features too smooth, too symmetrical, like a mannequin's approximation of humanity. I backed toward the post, not running but moving steadily, my eyes locked on the figure. She didn't follow, just stood there turning her head to track my movement, that same mechanical precision. When I reached the door, I practically fell inside. Dr. Blackwell was still at the satellite phone, and Vaughn was sorting equipment. Tyler was in his bunk, headphones on. There's someone outside, I said, my voice shaking. By the hole, just standing there. Vaughn grabbed binoculars and went to the window. After a moment of scanning, he lowered them. I don't see anyone. She was right there, standing next to the hole. Dr. Blackwell had stopped trying to use the phone. You saw a woman. I nodded, and something in my face must have convinced her, because she swore under her breath and said, "We're not going back out there. Not until the plane comes." We spent the next 3 days essentially barricaded in the post. The hole kept growing, we could see it from the window, expanding a foot or 2 each day. The bone spiral was growing, 2 new bones appearing overnight, extending the pattern farther and farther from the center. And we kept seeing the woman, or maybe women, it was hard to tell if it was the same figure or different ones. They'd appear at irregular intervals, standing near the hole, sometimes facing it, sometimes facing the post. Always too tall, always too still. The humming got louder. We could all hear it now, a deep vibration that made it hard to sleep, hard to think. Equipment started malfunctioning, our computers glitching, showing strings of nonsense data. The satellite phone stopped working entirely. On the 4th day of our self-imposed lockdown, Tyler started acting strange. He'd stand at the window for hours, just staring at the hole, and when we tried to talk to him, he'd answer in delayed responses, like his brain was processing everything a second too slow. "It's calling," he said once, and when I asked him what was calling, he just pointed at the hole. Dr. Blackwell pulled Vaughn and me aside. "We need to walk to the coast," she said quietly. It's about 15 miles. There's a fishing camp there that operates this time of year. We can get help." "What about Tyler?" "We'll convince him to come, but we leave tomorrow first thing. I don't care if the sun's at full peak or not, we're going." But when tomorrow came, or what we designated as tomorrow, Tyler was gone. His bunk was empty, the door to the post standing open. We found him standing at the edge of the hole, looking down into it, and he didn't respond when we called his name. Dr. Blackwell went to him, grabbed his arm, tried to pull him back. He shook her off with surprising strength and said, "I can hear them. They're singing." "Tyler, there's nothing down there," Dr. Blackwell said, but her voice lacked conviction. "They want to show me something," Tyler said, and before any of us could react, he stepped forward and dropped into the hole. He didn't scream, didn't make any sound at all, just disappeared into that perfect circle of darkness, and we heard no impact, no sound of him hitting bottom. Dr. Blackwell screamed his name, got down on her stomach and shined a flashlight into the hole, but there was nothing, just darkness extending down farther than the light could reach. We ran. Left everything, grabbed the minimal supplies we could carry, and started hiking toward the coast. 15 miles over rough tundra terrain, but we didn't care. We just had to get away from that hole, from those two tall figures that kept appearing in the distance, always watching. It took us almost a full day of continuous hiking. We reached the fishing camp exhausted and dehydrated, and the people there must have thought we were insane, babbling about holes and figures and missing researchers. They radioed for help, and a helicopter came for us 2 days later. Dr. Blackwell insisted they check on the research post on Tyler, and reluctantly they agreed to do a flyover. The post was gone. Not destroyed, not damaged, just gone. Where it should have been was an empty stretch of tundra, undisturbed, like nothing had ever been there. And where the hole had been was a large circle of bare ground, perfectly flat, nothing growing on it. Tyler Chen was listed as missing, presumed lost in an accident. Dr. Blackwell was put on administrative leave. Vaughn and I were debriefed extensively, and I'm sure our reports were filed somewhere they'd never be read seriously. I left climate research after that. Couldn't do fieldwork anymore, couldn't handle remote locations. Now I work at a university lab in Anchorage, and I never go farther north than the city limits. But sometimes I dream about that hole, about Tyler stepping into it without hesitation. And in those dreams, I can hear what he heard, singing, rising up from deep in the earth, in voices that aren't quite human. When I wake up, I check my apartment obsessively, making sure the floors are solid, making sure there are no perfect circles appearing in unexpected places. So far, everything's been normal, so far. Story 7. The hunting lodge 30 miles east of McGrath had been in the Walker family for 3 generations. My friend Chloe Walker invited me up there in September for what she called a relaxation weekend. A few days of fishing, hiking, disconnecting from the world. She inherited the place from her father 6 months earlier and wanted to show it off, said it was her favorite place on earth. I'd known Chloe since college, trusted her judgment, so I said yes. We drove up on a Friday afternoon in her truck, the road getting progressively worse until it was barely more than a trail through the forest. The lodge sat on the edge of a small lake, surrounded by birch trees that were just starting to turn golden. It was beautiful in that isolated, slightly unsettling way that Alaska wilderness always is. The lodge itself was rustic but comfortable, 2 bedrooms, a common area with a massive stone fireplace, a kitchen with propane appliances. There was no electricity, just a generator that Chloe said we'd only run for an hour in the evenings to charge phones and lights. No cell service, no internet, just us and the woods. My dad used to say this place had good energy, Chloe said, as we unloaded supplies. Said it was one of the few spots in Alaska where you could actually relax, where you didn't feel like the wilderness was actively trying to kill you. That should have been my first warning. Whenever someone says a place has good energy, it usually means they're trying to convince themselves of something. The first 2 days were fine. Great even. We hiked around the lake, caught a few small trout, spent evenings by the fire playing cards and talking about nothing important. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, clear skies, barely any wind. On Sunday morning, Chloe suggested we check out the old hunting blind her grandfather had built about 2 miles north of the lodge. She said it was in a beautiful clearing, had a great view of the migration route. We packed a lunch and headed out around 10. The hike was easy, following a clear trail through mature forest. We talked about work, about Chloe's plans for the lodge, about whether she should keep it or sell it. She was conflicted. The place held a lot of memories, but it was also a lot of responsibility, a lot of maintenance. We found the blind without any trouble. It was a well-built structure, basically a raised platform with a roof and walls on 3 sides, accessible by a ladder. The clearing around it was beautiful, about 100 yards across, carpeted with moss and low shrubs. Dad used to bring me here when I was a kid, Chloe said, climbing up the ladder. I never actually hunted, just sat with him and watched the animals. It was peaceful. I followed her up, and we settled on the platform to eat lunch. The view was exactly as she described. You could see for miles in the direction of the migration route, could watch the tree line without being visible yourself. We'd been there maybe 30 minutes when Chloe stiffened. Do you hear that? I listened. At first I didn't hear anything unusual, just wind and birds. Then I caught it, a low rhythmic sound like someone chopping wood, distant but distinct. Another hunter, I suggested. Shouldn't be. This is all family land and nobody else has access. Dad was religious about keeping it private. The chopping continued, steady and mechanical. It didn't seem to be getting closer or farther away, just maintaining the same volume and rhythm. Maybe we should head back, I said, suddenly uncomfortable. There was something about that sound, too regular, too persistent. Chloe nodded. Yeah, this doesn't feel right. We climbed down from the blind and started back toward the trail. The chopping sound followed us, or at least it seemed to. It stayed at the same volume no matter how far we walked, always in the distance, always that same steady rhythm. About halfway back to the lodge, we came across something that made Chloe stop dead. There were scratch marks on a large birch tree right next to the trail, deep gouges in the bark, like someone had taken a knife or an axe and carved 4 parallel lines straight down the trunk. The marks were fresh, white wood showing through, no weathering, no sap buildup. These weren't here when we passed through, Chloe said quietly. I would have noticed. We kept walking faster now. Neither of us said it, but we were both thinking the same thing. Someone or something was in these woods with us, and they'd marked that tree while we were at the blind. The chopping sound had stopped. We made it back to the lodge without incident, but the atmosphere had changed. What had felt cozy and isolated now felt exposed and vulnerable. Every window was a potential point of entry. Every sound outside made us jump. I'm sure it's nothing, Chloe said, but she was checking the locks on all the doors and windows as she said it. Probably just another hiker who got confused about property boundaries. We spent the afternoon inside, neither of us suggesting we go back out. Chloe tried to read, but I noticed she kept looking up at the windows. I attempted to journal, but my handwriting was shaky, distracted. As evening came, or what passed for evening in September, the sun just starting to dip toward the horizon, we heard the knock. It was on the back door, the one that led to the small deck overlooking the lake. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Chloe and I looked at each other. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. The knocks came again, same rhythm, same volume. "Hello," Chloe called out. "Who's there?" No answer, just silence for maybe 30 seconds, then 3 more knocks. I went to the window that overlooked the deck, careful to stay to the side where I could see out without being easily visible from outside. The deck was empty, no one standing at the door, no sign of anyone nearby, but there was something on the deck boards right in front of the door, something dark, arranged in a pattern. "Chloe," I said quietly, "come look at this." She joined me at the window, and I heard her breath catch. The pattern was made of small bones, arranged in a spiral identical to what I'd read about in. Wait, I hadn't read about it, but somehow I knew that pattern, knew its exact shape, knew it meant something wrong and ancient and patient. "We need to leave," Chloe said. "Right now, we'll pack what we can carry and drive back to McGrath tonight." "In the dark, Chloe, that road is barely passable in daylight." "I don't care, we're not staying here." She was already moving, grabbing her bag, stuffing clothes into it. I started to do the same, my hands shaking so badly I kept dropping things. That's when we heard the singing. It was coming from the woods, from multiple directions at once. Voices in harmony, singing something wordless and beautiful and completely inhuman. The melody wrapped around the lodge, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. Chloe had gone completely white. "That's not possible," she whispered. "That's my dad used to hear singing before he died. He told me about it. Said there were voices in the woods near the lodge, singing old songs. We thought it was dementia, thought he was confused." The singing continued, rising and falling in patterns that made my head ache. And underneath it, I could hear the chopping sound again, closer now, right outside the walls. "The truck," Chloe said. "We run for the truck. On 3, ready." I nodded, even though I wasn't ready, even though every muscle in my body was locked tight with terror. 1, 2, 3. We burst out the front door and ran for the truck parked 20 yards away. The singing cut off abruptly, and in the sudden silence I could hear footsteps, multiple sets of footsteps, running through the woods around us, pacing our movement. Chloe fumbled the keys, dropped them, grabbed them again. I was scanning the tree line, seeing movement in my peripheral vision, but nothing clear when I looked directly. The truck started, thank God, the truck started, and Chloe threw it in reverse, then forward, gunning the engine and spraying gravel as we accelerated down the trail. In the rearview mirror I saw them, figures emerging from the trees, too many to count, all tall and thin and wrong, moving with that same uncanny precision. They didn't chase us, just stood at the edge of the clearing and watched us leave. The drive back to McGrath took 4 hours, navigating that terrible road in darkness with only the truck's headlights. Neither of us spoke. When we finally hit pavement and saw the lights of town, Chloe pulled over and cried for 10 minutes straight. She sold the lodge 2 months later, sight unseen, to a buyer from out of state. She didn't tell them about the singing, about the figures, about any of it. Sometimes I feel guilty about that, but mostly I'm just glad we got out. Last week, Chloe called me, said she'd gotten a weird email from the new owner. They wanted to know if she knew anything about the local customs of leaving bone patterns on the deck. said they'd been finding them every morning, perfectly arranged spirals, and wanted to know if it was some kind of tradition they should respect. Chloe told them she didn't know what they were talking about and hung up. We haven't spoken since. I think we both know there's nothing we can do for those people, and I think we are both afraid of what might happen if we try. The story 8. The job listing was straightforward enough. Winter caretaker needed for a remote communications relay station. November through March, room and board provided plus generous salary. Minimal responsibilities, just keep the station heated, clear snow from the equipment, make sure nothing breaks down. Previous experience preferred but not required. The location was listed vaguely as Northern Interior Alaska. I was 24, between jobs, and the money was too good to pass up. Plus, I kind of liked the idea of being completely alone for 5 months. I'd always been introverted, and the thought of no neighbors, no traffic, no noise sounded like paradise. The interview was conducted via satellite phone with a man named Gene Reeves who said he was the regional supervisor for the communications company. He asked basic questions about my ability to handle isolation, my experience with generators and heating systems, whether I had any medical conditions that might be problematic in an emergency. I answered honestly, yes, no, and he hired me on the spot. I'll be straight with you, Gene said. We've had some trouble keeping caretakers at this particular station. Most don't last more than a month. But it's good pay, and if you can stick it out the full season, there's a completion bonus. I should have asked more questions. Should have asked what some trouble meant, why people didn't last. But I was young and broke and confident in my ability to handle solitude. A helicopter dropped me at the station in early November, along with 5 months' worth of supplies. The station itself was a small bunker-like structure, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, with thick walls and a flat roof covered in solar panels and satellite dishes. The interior was divided into a living area, a small equipment room, and a bathroom with a chemical toilet. The pilot, a quiet indigenous woman named Irene So, helped me unload the supplies, then gave me a brief orientation. Generator in the equipment room, check the fuel levels weekly. Radio for emergencies only, check-in protocol every Monday. Extra propane tanks stored outside in the shed. Any questions? What happened to the last caretaker? I asked. Irene's expression didn't change. He quit, called for early pickup after 3 weeks. Why? Didn't say, you'll do fine. Just keep busy, maintain your routine, and remember, spring always comes eventually. She left before I could ask what she meant by that. The first week was fine. I settled into a routine, morning equipment checks, afternoon reading or watching movies on my laptop, evening meals and radio check-ins. The isolation was peaceful, exactly what I'd been hoping for. At night, the aurora danced overhead, green and purple curtains of light that made the darkness feel less oppressive. The station sat on a low rise surrounded by black spruce forest, no other structures visible in any direction. The nearest human being was probably 50 miles away. The silence was absolute and beautiful. In the second week, I started finding things moved. Small things at first. My coffee mug would be on the table when I was sure I'd left it by the sink. A book I'd been reading face down would be closed when I came back from the bathroom. I told myself I was misremembering, that isolation was playing tricks on my perception. Then I found my boots outside. I'd taken them off by the door, left them in the small entryway where I always left them. When I woke up the next morning, they were sitting outside on the steps, placed neatly side by side. The door had been locked. I checked it twice before going to bed, an old habit. But somehow, my boots had gotten outside. I radioed in my Monday check-in and mentioned it to Gene. There was a long pause before he responded. "Probably just forgot you took them out," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I didn't. I'm sure I didn't." Another pause. "Look, kid, Marcus, right? Sometimes the isolation gets to people. Your brain starts filling in gaps, creating little mysteries to solve because you're bored. It's normal. Just keep to your routine, stay busy." But I knew I hadn't put my boots outside. Things escalated in week 3. I started hearing footsteps on the roof at night. Slow, deliberate steps, walking from one end of the building to the other. Each time I'd grab a flashlight and go outside to check, but there was never anything there. No tracks in the snow, no sign of animals, nothing. The equipment started acting up. The radio would turn on by itself, blasting static at 3 in the morning. The generator would rev and slow in rhythmic patterns, like someone was playing with the throttle. Lights would flicker in sequences that felt almost like communication, and I kept finding things moved. My food reorganized in the cabinets. My clothes folded differently than how I'd folded them. Small objects, a pen, a lighter, a can opener, arranged in careful lines on the table while I slept. On day 20, I woke up to find every single item I owned had been moved exactly 6 inches to the left. Everything. My bed, my clothes, my supplies, the furniture, all shifted precisely 6 inches to the left. It must have taken hours, must have been done while I was sleeping, and I hadn't heard a thing. I called for early pickup that morning. Gene tried to talk me out of it, reminding me about the completion bonus, but I didn't care. I told him I'd stay until the helicopter could reach me, probably 2 or 3 days depending on weather. "Don't go outside," Gene said, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. "Whatever happens, stay inside the station until pickup arrives." "Why? What's out there?" "I don't know," Gene said, and I believed him. Nobody knows, but every caretaker who's left early, they all say the same thing. It wants you to go outside. It tries to lure you out. Don't go. I spent the next 3 days in a state of sleepless paranoia, jumping at every sound. The footsteps on the roof became constant, sometimes dozens of feet walking back and forth. The door handle would rattle at odd hours, and through the window, I started seeing movement, shapes that looked almost human, standing at the edge of the forest, watching the station. On the second night, I heard my mother's voice calling from outside. She's been dead for 6 years, but the voice was perfect, exact, asking me to come out and talk to her. I didn't go. On the third night, the power went out completely. The generator had plenty of fuel, but it just stopped. I huddled in my sleeping bag with a flashlight, listening to something walking around the station, testing the walls, scratching at the door. When dawn came, or what passed for dawn in November, just a gradual lightening of the darkness, I looked out the window and saw words written in the snow. Large letters, maybe 3 feet high, arranged in a circle around the station. Stay, 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 stay. Over and over, spiraling inward toward the door. Irene arrived around noon, landing the helicopter on the marked pad 50 yards from the station. I grabbed my bag and ran for it, not looking back, not caring about anything I left behind. As we lifted off, I looked down at the station one last time. The words in the snow were gone, smoothed over like they'd never existed. But standing at the edge of the forest were dozens of figures, tall, thin, motionless, all facing the station. All watching where I'd been. Gene called a week later to inform me I wouldn't be getting the completion bonus, but he understood and wished me well. He also mentioned they were having trouble finding a new caretaker. Would I be interested in trying again next season? The pay would be even better. I hung up on him. Sometimes I wonder about that station, about whether they ever found someone to stay the full season. Part of me hopes they did, that someone was able to last where I couldn't. But mostly I hope they just shut the place down, left it empty, because I think whatever's out there was patient. Think it could wait months, years, for the right person to finally open that door. And I think eventually someone will. Story 9. My cousin Wade got the guiding license when he turned 25, started taking hunting groups into the Rangell Mountains for elk and caribou. It was good money, and Wade knew the terrain better than anyone, grew up in the area, had been hiking those mountains since he could walk. When he called in August asking if I wanted to work as his camp assistant for a week-long trip in September, I said yes. I needed the money, and it sounded like an easy job. Set up camp, cook meals, maintain gear while Wade took the clients hunting. The group was 4 men from Texas, experienced hunters, who'd paid premium rates for what Wade advertised as a true Alaska wilderness experience. They seemed decent enough when we met them at the airstrip, businessmen in expensive gear, excited about the trip, but not obnoxious about it. We flew into a valley about 60 miles from the nearest road, setting up base camp near a creek that ran crystal clear through a meadow. The weather was perfect, the landscape stunning, and the clients were happy. Everything pointed to an easy, profitable week. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. Wade took the clients out each morning. They saw plenty of game, and everyone returned to camp tired but satisfied. I'd have hot food ready, would maintain the tents and equipment, and we'd sit around the fire in the evenings trading stories. On the 3rd day, one of the clients, a guy named Bernard Lynch, who was quiet and observant, came back from the hunt without the others. Wade had sent him back early with instructions for me to have coffee ready. They'd be returning in an hour with an elk Bernard had taken. "Your cousin knows his stuff," Bernard said as I poured coffee. "Tracked that elk like he could read its mind." "He's been doing this since he was a kid," I said. "The mountains are practically his backyard." Bernard nodded, sipping his coffee. Then he said something that stuck with me. "This is beautiful country. But it doesn't feel empty, you know. Feels like something's always watching." I laughed it off at the time, told him it was just the wilderness, that you're never truly alone in Alaska. But his comment made me more aware of the forest around camp, of the shadows between trees, of the weight of isolation. Wade and the other clients returned an hour later, jubilant about Bernard's kill. We spent the evening processing the meat, hanging it to cool and celebrating. It felt like the trip was going perfectly. That night, something screamed in the forest. It wasn't an animal sound, or if it was, it wasn't any animal I recognized. It started low and climbed to a pitch that made my teeth hurt, held that note for maybe 10 seconds, then cut off abruptly. The silence afterward was somehow worse than the sound itself. Everyone in camp sat frozen, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. One of the clients, a younger guy named Luis Fernandez, said, "What the hell was that?" "Lynx probably," Wade said, "but I'd heard lynx before, and this wasn't it. They can make some pretty wild sounds." But I saw the way Wade's hand moved to the rifle propped against his chair, the way his eyes kept scanning the tree line. The scream came again an hour later from a different direction. Then again at 2 in the morning, close enough that it felt like it was right outside the tents. None of us slept much that night. In the morning, Wade found tracks. They were in the soft ground near the creek, maybe 30 yards from camp. They looked human, definitely bipedal, with 5 toes and something like a heel. But they were wrong. Too large, proportions off, and the stride between them was impossibly long. Bear, Wade announced, but everyone could see they weren't bear tracks. Those aren't, Bernard started to say, but Wade cut him off. Bear, he repeated firmly, walking on hind legs. They do that sometimes. The clients looked skeptical, but Wade was the expert and they wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe him too, but the tracks followed the creek for maybe 100 yards, then just stopped. Not like the thing had walked into the water or onto rocky ground where tracks wouldn't show. They just ended mid-stride, like whatever made them had been lifted into the air. Wade decided we should move camp. Said it matter-of-factly, like it was a normal part of the trip, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. We packed up, hiked about 5 miles to a different meadow, set up camp again. The clients were confused but cooperative, probably sensing that Wade knew something he wasn't saying. The second camp felt safer, more open, with better visibility in all directions. We settled in, and the afternoon hunt went well. Lewis took a caribou, and spirits were high again by evening. But after dark, we heard the singing. Multiple voices this time coming from the forest all around us. They were singing in harmony, in a language I didn't recognize, possibly not a language at all, just sounds that happened to sound language-like. The melody was beautiful and terrible, made me want to walk toward it and run away simultaneously. "Everyone stay in camp," Wade said, his voice tight. "Nobody goes into the woods. I don't care if you need to piss, you do it at the edge of the firelight." One of the clients, the oldest, a man named Garrett Howell, started to argue. "Now hold on, we paid good money." "I'll refund every penny," Wade interrupted. "But right now, you're going to listen to me. Something's wrong here. I've been guiding in these mountains for 6 years, and I've never seen or heard anything like this. So you're going to stay in camp, stay together, and we're calling for early extraction first thing tomorrow." The authority in his voice shut down any argument. We huddled around the fire all night, rifles loaded, watching the darkness. The singing continued until dawn, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always beautiful and wrong. At first light, Wade tried the satellite phone. It took 3 attempts to get a connection, but finally he reached the air service. They could have a plane to us by mid-afternoon, he said. We just needed to hold on for a few more hours. "Pack only essentials," Wade instructed. "We are leaving the tents, the camp gear, everything. Just grab your personal items and the meat. We'll be at the pickup point in 2 hours." We were breaking down the last of the gear when Bernard, who'd been standing watch at the edge of camp, called out, "Someone's coming." We all turned to look. A figure was walking toward us across the meadow, still maybe 200 yards away. Human-shaped, moving with a strange, gliding gait. "Hello," Garrett called out, waving. "Need help?" The figure stopped. For a moment it just stood there, perfectly still. Then it started walking toward us again, faster now, and as it got closer I could see it was wrong. Arms too long, head tilted at an angle that would break a human neck, movement too smooth. "Back to camp," Wade said quietly. "Everyone back right now." We retreated, keeping the fire between us and the approaching figure. It stopped at the edge of where our camp began, maybe 20 feet away, and I got my first clear look at it. It was shaped like a person the way a child's drawing is shaped like a person. All the right pieces in approximately the right places, but the proportions wrong, the details missing or distorted. Its face was smooth, features suggested rather than defined, and where its eyes should be were just dark indentations. It opened its mouth, or the place where a mouth should be, and the singing came out. That same impossible harmony from the night before, coming from a single throat, dozens of voices all at once. Wade raised his rifle. "Get away from this camp, now." The thing tilted its head, the movement boneless and fluid, then turned and walked back the way it had come. After 20 yards, it simply faded, becoming transparent and then gone. "Pack," Wade said, his voice shaking. "Pack right now, we are leaving." We practically ran to the pickup point, abandoning most of our gear, keeping only weapons and the most essential supplies. The 5-mile hike took us maybe 2 hours, everyone moving at a pace just short of panic. The plane couldn't come soon enough. We waited at the pickup clearing, rifles ready, scanning the tree line for movement. Once I saw something tall moving between distant trees, keeping pace with us, but never coming into the open. When the plane finally appeared, dropping toward the meadow, I've never felt such overwhelming relief. Wade refunded the clients in full and threw in extra for their trouble. They were understanding, said it wasn't his fault, but I don't think any of them will be coming back to Alaska for hunting. Wade still guides, but he won't take groups into the Rangers anymore. Sticks to areas closer to civilization, places where you can drive out if something goes wrong. He told me once, late at night after too many beers, that he thinks he knows what we saw. Said the Athabascan elders have stories about them, about things that look almost human but aren't, that live in the high country and don't like being disturbed. "Did you report it?" I asked. "Tell anyone official?" He laughed, bitter and tired. "And say what? That we saw monsters in the mountains? They'd pull my license, say I was irresponsible or crazy." I think about that thing walking toward us across the meadow sometimes. It's too smooth movement. It's impossible face. Think about all those voices singing from one throat. And I think about how vast Alaska is, how much wilderness there is that humans never touch, never see. How many things might be living out there, in the places we don't go. The story 10. The cabin on the Kenai Peninsula belonged to my girlfriend Emma Vasquez's family. A small A-frame about 15 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a rough dirt road that became impassable once the snow got too deep. Emma wanted to spend one last weekend there before winter closed it off for the season. Said she wanted to introduce me to her favorite childhood place. We drove up on a Friday in late October, the trees already bare and the first snow dusting the ground. The cabin was charming in that rustic way, wood stove for heat, propane for cooking, no electricity except what the small generator provided. There was a loft bedroom accessible by a ladder, a main room with big windows overlooking the forest, and a cramped bathroom with a composting toilet that Emma said builds character. "I used to come here every summer with my dad," Emma said as we unloaded supplies. "We'd fish in the creek, hike to the ridge, just disconnect from everything. It was perfect." I could see why she loved it. The isolation felt peaceful rather than threatening, the forest quiet and cathedral-like. We spent Friday evening cooking dinner on the propane stove and playing cards by lantern light, and I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed. A break from the city, from noise, from the constant connection to phones and computers. On Saturday morning, Emma suggested we hike to what she called the old homestead, a cabin that had been abandoned decades ago, about 3 miles into the forest. She'd explored it as a kid and wanted to show me, said it was a perfect example of Alaska history, the kind of place that made you imagine what life was like for early settlers. The hike was beautiful, following a barely visible trail through spruce forest and across small streams. Emma pointed out landmarks, a lightning-struck tree she'd always used as a marker, a rock formation that looked vaguely like a bear. She was animated, happy, more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. We found the homestead around noon. It was more intact than I'd expected, walls still standing, roof sagging but holding, windows empty but frames solid. The clearing around it was overgrown with alders and fireweed, nature slowly reclaiming what humans had built. "Dad and I used to eat lunch here," Emma said, pushing open the door. "We'd imagine what the people who lived here were like, what their lives were like." Inside, the cabin was dim and musty. Old furniture remained, a rusted bed frame, a collapsed table, shelves with ancient canning jars. There was something sad about it, this evidence of lives lived and abandoned, slowly being erased by time. Emma was poking through the debris, reminiscing, when I noticed the photographs. They were tacked to one wall, faded and water-damaged, but still visible. Family portraits. It looked like a man, a woman, 2 children. Normal homestead photos, the kind you'd expect to find in any old cabin. Except in every single photograph, there was a 5th figure. It stood behind the family, always slightly out of focus, tall and thin. In some photos it was barely visible, just a shadow. In others it was more distinct, and you could see it wasn't human. Proportions wrong, features blurred, presence wrong. "Emma," I said quietly, "look at these." She came over, studied the photos. Her smile faded. "That's weird. I don't remember those being there." "You explored this cabin before, right? As a kid?" "Yeah, lots of times, but I don't remember any photographs." She leaned closer. "What is that thing in the background?" We stood there examining the photos, and the longer I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. The figure wasn't just in the background of these family moments, it was looking at the camera. In every single picture, while the family smiled or posed naturally, that thing was staring directly at whoever was taking the photograph. "Let's go," I said. "This place is giving me the creeps." Emma nodded and we left the homestead, but the mood of the day had shifted. The hike back felt longer, the forest less peaceful. Emma was quiet, and I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling watched. When we got back to the cabin, Emma made tea while I started a fire in the wood stove. We didn't talk much, both of us lost in our own thoughts. As evening came, Emma asked, "Do you think that was real in the photographs?" "Probably just a defect in the development," I said, not believing it. "Or someone playing a joke, double exposing the film." "But in every picture..." I didn't have an answer for that. We went to bed early, climbing into the loft and burrowing into sleeping bags. I was exhausted from the hike and should have fallen asleep immediately, but I kept thinking about that figure, about how it had appeared in every photograph, always watching. Around midnight, I heard the ladder creak. I lay frozen, listening, slow, careful creaks like someone or something was climbing up to the loft. One step, then another, the old wood groaning under weight. "Emma," I whispered. "Emma, wake up." She mumbled something, still mostly asleep. The creaking stopped. Silence for maybe 10 seconds, then it continued. One more step, then another. I fumbled for the flashlight we'd left next to the sleeping bags, clicked it on and shined it toward the top of the ladder. Nothing, empty space, just the ladder leading down to the dark main room. But I'd heard it. I knew I'd heard something climbing. "What's wrong?" Emma was awake now, voice groggy. Something was on the ladder. She took the flashlight from me, leaned over the edge of the loft to shine it down into the main room. Everything looked normal. The wood stoves banked fire, providing a faint glow, our supplies where we'd left them, the door still closed and latched. "Probably just the cabin settling," she said. "Old places make noise." But I could hear the doubt in her voice. We lay back down, but neither of us slept. Every sound, the wind outside, the stove ticking as it cooled, the cabin's normal creaks made us tense. Around 2 in the morning, we heard tapping on the window. The loft window looked out over the forest, just a small square pane. The tapping was rhythmic, tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 not like a branch blown by wind. Deliberate. Emma grabbed the flashlight and shined it at the window. For just a second, I saw something pressed against the glass. Something pale, with features that were almost human but wrong, too elongated, too smooth. Then it was gone, and there was just our reflection in the dark glass. "Did you see that?" Emma's voice was shaking. "Oh yeah. That couldn't have been. I don't know what it was." We huddled together for the rest of the night, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally came, gray and reluctant, we packed our things in record time. Emma wanted to leave immediately, but I convinced her we should check the perimeter first, see if there were any tracks or signs of what had been tapping on the window. Outside, in the fresh snow that had fallen during the night, we found footprints. They circled the cabin, coming up to each window, standing at each door. Human-shaped but wrong, too large, toes too long, stride too wide. The same impossible tracks I'd heard about in stories, the kind that shouldn't exist but somehow did. At the loft window where we'd heard the tapping, the prints showed where something had stood on its hind legs, reaching up to the glass. And pressed into the window pane, visible now in daylight, was a handprint. The fingers were impossibly long, splayed wide, pressed hard enough to leave marks in the condensation that had frozen on the glass. We left everything non-essential, threw our bags in the truck and drove out of there faster than was safe on that rough road. Neither of us spoke until we hit pavement, and even then it was just Emma saying, "I'm never going back there." She put the cabin up for sale 2 months later. When the realtor asked why, Emma just said it wasn't practical to keep a place so remote. The cabin sold quickly. Some couple from Anchorage wanted a weekend getaway. Emma didn't tell them about the photographs in the abandoned homestead, didn't tell them about the tapping on the window or the impossible footprints in the snow. Sometimes I wonder if we should have, if we had some obligation to warn them about what was out there in that forest. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. Try not to remember that pale face pressed against the glass, those 2 long fingers tapping on the window. Try not to wonder what it wanted, standing outside our window at 2 in the morning, watching us while we pretended to sleep. Last month, Emma got a text from an unknown number. Just 2 words, "Come back." She changed her number the next day. We don't talk about the cabin anymore. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more terrifying encounters from the far reaches of Alaska. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most. Was it the singing voices, the impossible footprints, or something else entirely? Share this with your friends who love a good scare, and remember, sometimes the most remote places aren't empty at all. Until next time, stay safe out there. And maybe think twice before venturing too deep into the wilderness.